at the ceiling of his room. Last night's sleeping felt impossible for Ling, and the tears that continued to flow seemed to be friends in the silence. Gradually, her crying stopped, not because the sadness disappeared, but because her body was no longer able to produce tears. His eyes were tired and the pain seemed to drain all his energy. Breaking up with Min was something Ling had never imagined, even in her worst nightmares. All this time, Min was a figure who always relied on him, someone who made him feel strong and whole. Now, after all that is over, how can he continue his life without Min? The world that once felt happy now seems empty and meaningless. TSK. Ling turned his head slowly. In the doorway, Orm stood with a tray in his hands. His face looked a little surprised when he saw that Ling was awake, but still lying on the bed. "Oh, it turns out Peeling is awake," said Orm, trying to smile even though he could clearly see how fragile Ling was at that moment. Orm stepped over and placed the tray on the bedside table. "It's time for breakfast, Fi." Ling just shook his head slowly, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "I have no appetite to eat." Orm sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Ling's face worriedly. "Fi has to eat, even if it's just a little. Fi's body needs energy," he persuaded gently. Accidentally, Orm's hand touched Ling's, and he immediately felt something was wrong. "We? Peeling's body is hot," said Orm in a worried tone. He immediately touched Ling's forehead with the back of his hand, and panic began to appear on his face. "Gosh, it looks like Peeling has a fever." Without waiting for Ling's answer, Orm got up quickly and left the room. Ling just stared blankly at the door. Her body didn't have the strength to respond. A few moments later, Orm returned carrying a small basin filled with water and a clean cloth. He placed the basin on the side table, then dipped the cloth into the water, wringing it gently before placing it on Ling's forehead. "This must be because of last night," Orm muttered quietly, more to himself than for Ling to hear. Carefully, he wiped Ling's face, from forehead, cheeks, to neck, with gentle but sure movements. Ling remained silent. Not a word left his lips. However, his eyes couldn't leave looking at Orm, who was so serious about wiping his body. In that silence, there was only the soft sound of cloth being wrung and the movement of Orm's hand, which provided a little comfort for Ling in the midst of such deep sadness. "If you have a fever like this, you have to eat first, then take medicine so that the pain doesn't get worse," said Orm as he placed the freshly wrung cloth in a basin filled with water. His hand moved to reach for the bowl of porridge that had been prepared on the small table beside Ling's bed. However, his movements were stopped when his cell phone rang. Orm took his cell phone from his pocket and quickly read the notification that appeared. He glanced briefly at Ling. "Peeling. It looks like I have to leave for a moment to see P-Saint." His voice sounded soft, as if he was hesitant to leave Ling alone in such a condition. Ling turned his head slightly, even though he looked weak. His voice still sounded clear. "Yes, you can go. I'm fine here alone," he answered, in a tone that was almost a whisper but still sounded firm. Orm looked at Ling worriedly. "Peeling. Don't do anything reckless like last night, okay? I'm worried," he said seriously, his eyes showing genuine concern. Ling looked back at Orm. "Yes, I won't," he answered simply. Orm breathed a sigh of relief. Then, with a small smile on his face, he raised his little finger in front of Ling. "Promise?" he asked while waiting for a response. Ling was silent for a moment, staring at Orm's face before finally moving his gaze towards the little finger stretched out in front of him. Slowly, he linked his pinky with Orm's. "I promise," he said confidently. Orm smiled with satisfaction. "Good. Then, I'll go first. I'll be back as soon as possible," he said as he got up from his seat, ready to go out. However, before he really left, He looked back at Ling. "Oh, and don't forget to eat the porridge, okay? I've also prepared other food in the kitchen if you're hungry later," said Orm with a warm smile on his face. "See you later." He waved, then opened the bedroom door slowly so as not to make any noise. Ling remained silent, but her gaze didn't leave Orm until the girl disappeared behind the door. Without realizing it, a small smile appeared on her lips. The warmth of Orm's attention felt so deep in her heart. This morning, Lingling felt that her body was fresh, as if all the fatigue that had been building up was slowly melting away with the flowing water. Lingling looked at herself in the mirror, then wiped the remaining water on her face with a soft white towel she had just taken from the shelf. 3 days earlier, Lingling felt that her body was really weak. A high fever, accompanied by a headache that wouldn't go away, forced him to stop all his activities and rest at home. Her body seemed to be asking for time to stop. After facing the sadness of breaking up with Min, her ex-lover, after finishing dressing and straightening her hair, Ling stepped out of her room. A calm morning atmosphere enveloped the house, the only sound being the sound of his footsteps slowly descending the stairs. When we reached the ground floor, the aroma of delicious food wafted from the kitchen. Ling stopped for a moment, smelled the tempting aroma, then without hesitation stepped into the kitchen. When he arrived in the kitchen, he saw an unusual sight. Orm was busy cooking in front of the stove, looking very focused on preparing something. Orm's face looked serious, but his hands moved nimbly, mixing and processing the food ingredients in the pan. Ling stood quietly in the doorway, watching his friend and assistant curiously. "Peeling," Orm called in a soft tone. When he raised his head and noticed Ling's presence, who was now standing near the kitchen door, Ling stepped in closer, looking at Orm with a raised eyebrow. "What are you doing?" he asked in a flat voice, even though in his heart he was curious. "I'm preparing breakfast for Phi," answered Orm while remaining focused on stirring the food in the pan. Without taking his eyes off the slightest, Ling tilted her head slightly, her eyes observing Orm's movements and the cooking that seemed to be almost finished. "Why bother cooking? You just need to buy food as usual," he said while glancing at the food in the wok. His habit was to tell Orm to buy his favorite breakfast outside, so this scene was quite surprising to him. Orm stopped what he was doing for a moment and looked at Ling with a faint smile. Because it's not healthy to keep eating food bought outside. Moreover, Peeling has just recovered from illness. "So, I think it would be better if I cooked for you," answered Orm in a calm tone. Ling frowned, as if not completely agreeing. He narrowed his eyes, examining Orm's cooking with skepticism. "I'm sure the taste of the food won't taste good," he muttered, even though his eyes remained glued to the appetizing-looking food. He swallowed hard unconsciously, triggered by the delicious, tempting aroma. Orm just smiled at Ling's comment. He transferred the cooked food to a plate and handed it to Ling, along with the spoon that had been prepared for him. "Try it first, Phi. I'm sure you like it," said Orm as he handed the spoon into Ling's hand. Ling looked at the spoon handed to her with a doubtful look, but in the end she took it. "Okay, but if this isn't delicious, you have to immediately go and buy the breakfast I usually eat," he said firmly, giving an ultimatum while glaring at Orm. "Agreed," Orm answered simply, without hesitation. He waited quietly, his eyes following Ling's every movement as he slowly scooped food from the plate. Ling glanced briefly at Orm before finally shoving the food into his mouth. Once the food entered his mouth, he chewed slowly. His face was flat, but slowly the expression on his face began to change. The taste turned out to be much better than he had imagined. Ling felt the right combination of spices and the soft texture of the food, making him secretly enjoy every bite. After a few seconds of what felt like a long silence, Orm asked curiously, How was it? Phi, it was delicious, right? Ling stopped chewing, looking at Orm with an expression that was hard to read. He didn't answer immediately, then turned his gaze to the food on the plate. Just so, he muttered softly, even though it was clear that he liked the dish more than just so. Orm chuckled, understanding that it was Ling's way of confessing without losing his prestige. I'm glad Phi likes it, Orm answered, his smile growing wider. Ling pretended not to hear, but his hand automatically took another spoonful, then fed the food into his mouth without saying much. Even though his lips didn't say much, Ling's actions were enough to explain that Orm's cooking had succeeded in satisfying his appetite that morning. The atmosphere inside the Siam Paragon Mall that afternoon was noisy with crowds of people, increasingly filling the main area. Hundreds of visitors were seen gathered around the large stage, which had been decorated for the Destiny Clinic event. The excitement in the air was palpable, especially because the event would be attended by Lingling Sirilak Kwong, a famous star who has recently been in the media spotlight. Loyal fans and journalists have been arriving since morning, each with a camera in hand, ready to capture every moment of the artist's appearance. The noise began to get louder when the news came that Lingling had arrived. Not long after, Lingling's name was shouted by the fans standing along the entrance to the stage. Lingling appeared from behind the crowd, walking gracefully with a faint smile on her face. His every movement was full of charm, and every now and then he waved his hands, greeting the fans who kept calling his name. Beside Lingling, Orm, her loyal assistant, walked quietly. Model Orm continued to be alert, paying attention to the atmosphere which seemed busier than usual. As someone who always accompanies Lingling at every public event, Orm is used to crowds and the spotlight of cameras. Orm turned his head slightly, making sure Lingling was okay. Although Lingling's face still wore a charming smile, Orm could feel that there was a hint of nervousness hidden behind her expression. They walked towards the back of the stage, through the crowd, fans and reporters who kept calling Lingling's name. After they arrived, Lingling sat on the chair provided, ready to wait for the event to start. Orm, ever caring, leaned closer to Ling, his hand gently touching the woman's shoulder. Is Phi okay? Orm asked, his voice soft and caring. Although Lingling looked calm on the outside, Orm knew exactly when something was up. Disturbed his mind, Ling glanced at Orm briefly, then nodded slowly. I'm fine, he answered in a low voice, trying to be reassuring. A faint smile graced his face, but Orm could see that it did not fully reflect his true feelings. Orm, who was used to dealing with situations like this, immediately took the initiative. She took a drink bottle from her bag and gave it to Lingling. Drink it, Phi. This might help calm your nervousness, said Orm, handing him the bottle with a gentle smile. Lingling accepted the bottle slowly. Her eyes stared at Orm for a moment before starting to drink the water. Ling took several deep breaths, trying to calm himself. This event was his first public appearance after a period of absence, due to illness and breaking up with Min. Everything will be fine, Phi, said Orm with full confidence, as if read Ling's thoughts. He gave a reassuring smile, his hand again gently touching Ling's shoulder, providing a comforting touch. Ling smiled slightly, more sincerely this time. For some reason, Ling felt that Orm's presence by her side seemed to give her a sense of security and always supported her in difficult times. It felt strange to Ling that she felt lucky to have someone like Orm by her side, someone who understood her more than anyone else and always knew how to make her feel better. Not long after, a sound came from the loudspeaker indicating that the event was about to start. Lingling took another deep breath, then stood up from his seat. He straightened his clothes and hair, preparing to face the camera. Spotlight and public attention that was waiting for him in front of the stage. "Thank you, Orm," said Ling before walking out onto the stage. The words were short but full of meaning. Orm just nodded and stood near the stage. "Nong Orm, Nong Orm." A boisterous voice calling his name could be heard from the crowd near the stage. Orm, who was standing not far from the stage, turned his head quickly. His gaze immediately caught the enthusiastic faces of Ling's fans, who were gathered on the edge of the barrier. They waved their hands with cheerful smiles. Some of them were even seen carrying banners and posters of Ling. "Yeah," Orm replied with a friendly smile, his face radiating warmth as usual. The fans immediately reacted more enthusiastically. Several people started asking Orm questions one after another, sounding overlapping but full of enthusiasm. Orm, with his relaxed and friendly attitude, still smiled in the face of the series of questions. Despite being Ling's personal assistant, he sometimes takes time to talk to Ling's fans. Orm is already known by the Ling fan community as someone who is friendly and easy to talk to, so he is often greeted or even invited to take photos with him. The Destiny Clinic event had ended successfully, but Lingling Sirilak Kwong still had one more task before she could truly rest. He had to undergo interviews with reporters who were waiting outside the stage. Nervousness took hold of Ling again, even stronger than before. This wasn't her first interview, but something was different this time. Maybe it's because of the burden of thoughts he's been carrying since the last few days, or maybe because of the topic he will be asking about later. However, when he looked at Orm, who was standing not far in front of him, the nervousness seemed to slowly disappear. Orm smiled at him, a simple smile, but reassuring. Ling felt as if that smile had the power to calm her, as if to hypnotize her and make her forget the anxiety that had filled her mind. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her heartbeat. His heart was beating fast, pealing. Orm's soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Ling looked up and looked at his assistant's face. "Yes, what is up?" he answered slowly. Orm smiled again, the same smile as before, full of support. "Come on, the journalists are waiting," he said in a soft but firm tone. Ling nodded slowly, taking one more breath to calm herself. With steady steps, he walked towards the interview venue. Now Ling was standing in the middle of a crowd of journalists and fans, with various microphones from various media aimed at him. The camera flash dazzled his vision, but he kept his smile. Reporters started asking various questions, mostly related to today's event, Destiny Clinic, and Ling's performance, which was considered perfect by the public. Ling answered calmly, her voice still sounding smooth and confident. His smile never faded when he gave explanations regarding upcoming projects and collaborations with various parties. However, the atmosphere changed slightly when a reporter asked a question that Ling had anticipated but was never really ready to answer. "What about your relationship with Min? Is it true that you two have separated?" Ling's expression suddenly changed, even though he still tried to maintain his smile. There was a short pause before he answered, but not so long that it was noticeable. "As you all know, we have really separated," he answered in a calm tone. "We parted on good terms and remain friends. There are no problems between us. This is a mutual decision, and we support each other." Ling, who had prepared himself thoroughly, provided several clarifications about various negative rumors that had circulated about him and his failed relationship. He explained that there was no major drama behind the breakup and that his personal life remained fine. That night, after a long and tiring day, Ling finally returned home. His days as a public figure always filled with a busy schedule, making him feel drained of energy every time he comes home from an event. Without thinking, He immediately threw himself onto the sofa, feeling the soft sofa cushions that seemed to hug his tired body. The room felt quiet. Only Ling's heavy breathing was heard. However, amidst the silence, a soft voice broke the silence. "Peeling." Orm, the personal assistant, called Ling softly. Orm stepped slowly towards Ling, carrying an aura full of caution. "Because everything is finished, I will go home first, ... he said politely, bowing slightly to say goodbye. Ling, who had originally just sat quietly with heavy eyes, was suddenly moved. Seeing Orm, who was about to leave, an impulse within him made him get up from the sofa quickly. Without thinking, he grabbed Orm's arm, stopping him in his tracks. Ling stood in front of Orm, looking at him with a deep but silent gaze. Several seconds passed without a word being said. Only their eyes met. Orm, who was surprised by Ling's actions, glanced at Ling's hand that was still holding his arm. After that, his gaze returned to Ling's face, looking for an explanation behind his silence. "Thank you for today," Ling finally spoke, his voice low but full of meaning. A faint smile appeared on his lips, adding warmth to the atmosphere that had felt stiff. "You're welcome, Peeling," Orm replied softly, his eyes still unmoving. From Ling's face, there was something in the gazes of the two of them that made the atmosphere calmer. "Thank you too for helping me through difficult times," Ling continued. This time his voice was quieter, as if the words came from the depths of his heart. When their eyes met again, time seemed to stop. Ling and Orm silent, lost in each other's gaze. The seconds that passed felt like minutes, while the world around them disappeared. There were just the two of them in a moment filled with feelings that were difficult to express. Orm nodded slowly, then his hand moved to hold the back of Ling's hand, which was still on his arm. "It's my job as Vi's personal assistant. Apart from that, Vi has also helped me in difficult times in the past," said Orm in a low tone. Ling furrowed his brows, confused by what he had just heard. "What do you mean?" "It is nothing," Orm replied quickly, realizing what he said made him immediately change the topic. "Then, I'll go home first, Peeling." Without waiting for an answer, Orm turned around and ran quickly from the room. His steps were hurried, as if he wanted to immediately avoid a conversation that might be too deep at the moment. Ling could only stare at Orm's back that was getting further away, while his mind was filled with questions. Orm's words just now echoed in his head, making him feel a little confused and curious. In the past, have I known Orm before? That morning, it was only 7 o'clock. But Ling had already arrived at the shooting location for the advertisement with the theme of morning sports. The atmosphere around the field used as a shooting location is still cool. Sunlight is just starting to shine through the trees, and the crew seems busy preparing all the necessary equipment. Ling, with the seriousness and professionalism that he always brings to every job, was ready for a day full of physical activity. Some scenes had to be redone due to small details that needed to be perfected. The director continued to give directions, and Ling without hesitation followed every instruction given. Every time he finished taking a picture, he would walk over to the monitor to see the recording results. His sharp gaze checked the camera screen, making sure the expressions, movements, and lighting were perfect as expected. After several repetitions, Ling started to feel tired. That's when Orm, who had been faithfully accompanying him since morning, approached with him. "A bottle of cold drink." "Peeling, drink first," said Orm, handing him the bottle. Ling smiled faintly, taking the bottle from Orm's hand. "Thank you, Norm," he said, feeling relieved to get a little rest between his busy shooting schedule. Without wasting any time, Ling opened the bottle cap and started drinking using the attached straw. However, after only a few sips, he suddenly stopped when he felt Orm's hand touch his face. Reflexively, Ling raised his head, His gaze directly met Orm's eyes. Orm looked a little confused seeing Ling looking at him so intensely. "I'm just fixing peeling as makeup," he said with an awkward smile. Orm's hands gently smoothed Ling's slightly messy hair due to wind and movement during filming. Then, carefully, Orm took a tissue from his pocket and wiped the sweat that was starting to appear on Ling's forehead. Orm's movements were so natural and gentle, they made Ling speechless. Ling's eyes remained on Orm, watching every movement of his assistant's hands, who painstakingly looked after him. There's a warmth implicit in caring. Small child, even though it seemed Orm was only carrying out his duties as an assistant. However, for Ling, this attention is more than just an obligation. He felt calm, protected, and strangely comfortable to be in. Near Orm, after making sure Ling's makeup and hair were neat, Orm stepped back a little, making room for Ling. "Are you ready for the next scene, peeling?" he asked, smiling gently. Ling woke up from her reverie. She shook her head slightly, feeling strange about herself being swept up in that simple moment. "Yes, I'm ready," he answered briefly, although in his heart he still felt a strange tremor every time he was near Orm. After several hours of tiring filming, Ling finally breathed a sigh of relief when the clock struck 11 a.m. Filming the morning sports-themed advertisement was quite intense, with various scenes that required full energy and concentration. Even though he was tired, Ling felt satisfied because every shooting went smoothly as expected. The crew and director also seemed happy with the results of their hard work. Ling plans to approach Orm, who has been faithfully accompanying him since morning, but his steps suddenly stopped when he saw an unexpected sight. In the corner of the waiting room, Orm seemed to be asleep in a sitting position. His body slumped slightly forward, and his hand was still holding the iPad, which he usually used to record Ling's schedule. Ling smiled slightly. Even though Orm often looked cheerful and full of enthusiasm, Ling knew how tired Orm was every time he accompanied him to filming since the morning. Without wanting to wake Orm, Ling walked slowly and sat beside him. He watched Orm's face sleep peacefully. Although there was a hint of tiredness showing on his face, Ling took his jacket, which was lying on the table, then carefully put it over Orm's body so he wouldn't get cold. This small action made Ling feel calmer, as if he was returning the attention that Orm always gave him. Ling sat there, letting Orm enjoy his sleep for a while. The atmosphere at the shooting location was starting to get quiet. The crew was busy tidying up the equipment, and Ling used the time to rest for a while waiting for Orm to wake up on his own. Time continued to pass, until finally Orm moved slowly. His eyelids began to open. He looked confused for a moment when he realized Ling was sitting next to him looking at him. "Peeling, why didn't you wake me up?" Orm asked, rubbing his eyes. Ling just smiled. "You look very tired. I didn't want to disturb you," he answered softly. Orm blushed slightly, feeling embarrassed for falling asleep in the middle of his task. "Sorry, I accidentally fell asleep. It's okay. You need rest too," Ling replied in a warm voice. Orm immediately got up from his seat as soon as he woke up from his sleep. He felt bad because he had fallen asleep in the middle of his work. Quickly, he grabbed the iPad in his hand. His eyes moved quickly to check Ling's schedule. After checking, Orm looked at Ling, who was sitting beside him. "After this, Peeling doesn't have any more schedules. Do you want to go straight home, or do you have plans to go somewhere else first?" Orm asked in his soft but professional voice. Ling, who seemed calm after a long day, thought for a moment before answering. I have an appointment with my friends," he said casually while glancing at his watch. "You just go home and rest." Orm, although a little surprised by Ling's answer, immediately responded, Okay then. I'll take Peeling and then I can pick Peeling up when I'm done." Ling shook her head quickly, a small smile forming on her face. No need, Orm. I'll go home with my friend later. You can go straight home and rest. You've worked hard today. Orm stared at Ling for a moment, making sure that the decision was final, and then nodded his head. Okay then, Orm replied with, obedient because he never denied Ling's orders. There has been no long rest in Orm's life lately. After finishing his work with Ling, Orm headed straight to campus to attend afternoon classes. This class is very important for him because he has to prepare for an exam supervised by one of the fiercest lecturers on campus. With full concentration, Orm tried to absorb all the material he had studied during his busy schedule as Ling's assistant. After class finished, Orm sighed at the pineapple and felt relieved because managed to pass the exam well. While tidying up his books, suddenly he heard a cheerful voice calling him. Let us eat, View exclaimed, embracing Orm's shoulder enthusiastically. Orm, who was tired and wanted to go home immediately, only shook his head weakly. I'm full, he answered briefly, trying to refuse the offer. In fact, he preferred to rest at home rather than eat with his friends. However, this time it was Priking who spoke, unwilling to accept Orm's refusal. No resistance, he said firmly as he pulled Orm's hand to stand up. It's been a long time since we got together because you were always busy with evening classes. Orm stood up reluctantly, looking at Priking as he sighed once more. Okay, but just eat. After that I'll go home, he said resignedly. Agree, shouted the three friends together, happy that they had succeeded in persuading Orm. They left the classroom and walked together towards the campus cafeteria. After ordering food, they sat at a comfortable table and continued their conversation that had been postponed. Suddenly, a small cough broke through their warm conversation. Orm looked up and saw a man standing next to him. Min, he muttered softly. Am I bothering you? Min asked with a gentle smile on his face. No, you, Milk and Priking answered in unison, trying to show that they weren't bothered by Min's presence. Min then asked in a calm voice, Can I sit here? There's something I want to talk to Orm about. Milk, who was sitting beside Orm, immediately stood up and invited Min to sit in her place. Of course, he said politely. Seeing the situation, Priking immediately offered a solution. Shall we move to another table? He motioned for View and Milk to move along, making room for Orm and Min to talk more comfortably. View nodded in agreement. That's right, we'll just sit over there, he said. While standing, Orm could only stare at his three friends, who left him alone with Min. The atmosphere suddenly became a little awkward, and Orm felt the need to break the silence. So, what did you want to talk about? He asked straight to the point. Min smiled slightly. Nothing too serious, he said. My parents want to meet you and have lunch together next week. Orm looked at Min with some surprise. Still next week? Why is Vi telling me now? He asked. Min chuckled softly, teasing Orm gently. Have you forgotten how busy you are? So, I thought it would be better to tell you now so you can clear your schedule. Orm smiled, realizing the truth of Min's words. Okay, I will. Trying to organize my schedule, he answered, feeling happy to hear Orm's answer. Min suddenly cupped Orm's cheeks with both hands. Thank you very much, Norm, he said in a sweet tone. However, Orm was quick to react, holding Min's hand before she did anything more. Stop, he said, pushing Min's body gently. Don't do excessive things like that. Min smiled shyly, then whispered, Sorry, I forgot. Orm shifted slightly in his seat when the food he ordered had arrived. To accompany Orm, Min also ordered food and continued their small talk. Meanwhile, View, Milk and Priking gossip a little about Min and Orm's relationship, which always seems romantic. It's not uncommon for a campus to also crown the Orm couple as the most harmonious couple. In a luxurious restaurant, Ling stepped gracefully towards the table that had been booked according to their appointment. Even though there was no special event that day, Ling felt it necessary to make time to meet his old friends. In the midst of seemingly endless busyness, the opportunity to simply relax and refresh your mind is a luxury in itself. As soon as Ling arrived at the table, a familiar voice greeted him. Finally, Ling turned his head and saw faces he hadn't seen for a long time. He smiled, then sat on the chair that had been prepared. After a while, he immediately ordered a drink to relieve the thirst in his dry throat. After 100 centuries, Lingling Sirilak Kwong finally met us again, Angfa exclaimed with a chuckle, teasing Ling, who was known as a busy figure among them. Ling couldn't help but smile at the joke. I'm busy preparing for the new series, so I just had time to join you, he answered to his old friends Charlotte, Angfa, and Freen. They're all friends who have known him since his student days at Mahado University. We understand, said Charlotte, nodding. That's why we changed the meeting schedule several times, so that you could come along. Angfa, who had always looked enthusiastic, immediately added, what's important now is that you've come to this little reunion. That's the most important thing. Freen, who was sitting on the other side of the table, smiled while gently stirring his drink. Indeed, our schedule now is very different from when we were at college. In the past, we could hang out together at a cafe after class at any time. But now, well, it's like this. We have to arrange a schedule for months. Ling nodded, really feeling what Freen said. Yes, it feels like time has passed so quickly. Suddenly we are at this point with our respective activities. But I'm glad we can still make time to meet like this, he said with a warm smile. They all laughed a little, soaking in the togetherness that felt so precious amidst the hustle and bustle of their respective lives. Even though life has taken them on different paths, their friendship remains strong. Oh yes, sorry I wasn't at your wedding, said Ling, patting Freen's shoulder gently. A lot of things happened suddenly, so I can only send a gift. Freen smiled faintly at Ling's apology. No problem. I know you take care of a lot of things, including taking care of your heart, right? He replied in a meaningful tone. Ling nodded slowly. Yes, I need to organize my life, especially after breaking up with Min, he answered honestly, even though there was a hint of pain in his voice. Charlotte, who had been listening carefully, immediately looked emotional. How could that guy dump her, such a perfect friend? He exclaimed in an angry tone, seeing Charlotte starting to drift into anger. Angfa immediately patted her shoulder, gesturing to her lover to calm down. Never mind, no need to discuss it anymore, said Angfa. What's clear is that this man doesn't deserve Lingling Kwong. Charlotte nodded but still looked annoyed. That's right, men are like that, he said, looking at Angfa. Without hesitation, Charlotte hugged Angfa's arm and said, that's why I don't like men. I only like Angfa or ha. Ling, who saw their interaction, just chuckled. Oh enough. I can't stand the smell of this Busan, he teased with a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. After their laughter died down, Freen tried to change the topic. By the way, your new assistant is Orm, right? He asked in a curious tone. Ling nodded. Yes, he is still on probation as my assistant for 3 months. If his work is good, I will appoint him as a personal assistant, he answered calmly. Hearing that answer, Angfa chuckled and shook his head. You talk as if you don't know Orm before, he said with a meaningful smile. Huh? Ling frowned, confused by Angfa's statement. Orm Kornnaphat, right? Continued Charlotte while reminding her. Isn't he the geeky junior who used to share the boarding house with you? I still remember how surprised I was when Lingling Kwong wanted to share a boarding room with someone else. even though you flatly refused when I wanted to share a boarding room with you first. Ling was silent for a moment. His expression changed, as if his thoughts were lost, bringing back forgotten memories of the past. It seems you just realized that Orm is that geeky girl, Freen asked while looking at Ling, who looked a little stunned. It's natural that he forgot, added Angfa. That girl has now grown into a very beautiful adult woman. Ling looked at her three friends with a confused look, still trying, processing the facts he had just heard. Why didn't you guys tell me in the first place? He asked, a little annoyed but still in a joking tone. We talked about it in the group a week ago, remember? Charlotte explained. Freen was the first to bring it up, but it seems like you were busy and didn't have time to read all our chats. Ling just sighed. You guys talk about too many things in the group. Besides, I rarely open my cell phone unless there's something urgent, he answered, smiling faintly. Orm is very beautiful now. Maybe if I hadn't married Becky, I would have approached him, said Freen with a chuckle, his tone clearly joking, but still provoking a reaction from his friends. We Freen, shouted Charlotte, while hitting Freen's back lightly with a half-serious expression. I'll complain to Becky if her husband starts looking at other women. Freen's eyes immediately widened at the subtle threat. Without hesitation, he immediately put his arm around Charlotte's shoulder, trying to persuade her in his typical style. I'm just kidding. Don't say anything to Becky, please, he said in a sweet tone, trying to diffuse the situation. Husbands are afraid of their wives, Angfa teased, seeing Freen, who looked panicked. His mischievous expression couldn't be hidden, and his chuckles could be heard in between the sentences. Freen, who was starting to feel cornered, immediately responded quickly. Aren't you afraid of your wife too? He asked, glancing at Angfa with a challenging look. Angfa just smiled casually, as if the question meant nothing to him. Not really, we're not married yet, he answered in a very calm tone, as if the matter was not that important. Angfa, Charlotte suddenly exclaimed in an annoyed tone. He folded his arms in front of his chest, looking at Angfa with an expression that clearly showed dislike. Don't talk to me anymore, he said in a more serious tone, although there was a hint of joking inside. Angfa, who felt the atmosphere was starting to get tense, quickly responded, I'm just kidding, honey. Even though we're not married yet, we will be married soon. And of course I'm always afraid of you, he said modestly, trying to soften Charlotte's heart, which was starting to sulk. In the midst of chatter full of jokes and laughter from his three friends, Ling just sat quietly, lost in his own thoughts. Ling had started to remember everything. Orm, who is now his personal assistant, turns out to be someone who was his roommate when he was in college. No wonder Orm's face always looked so familiar to her eyes. Ling now understood why from the first time they worked together, he felt so comfortable around Orm. It was as if there was something inexplicable, a connection that was established quickly, without much effort.